Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for this year's third Teachers in Animal Law webinar. We're really excited to be kicking off this webinar series again with such an important topic and some fantastic panelists. Before we get into panelist introductions, I'd like to give a brief overview of this webinar series for those of you who may not be very familiar with it. The Animal Law program at GW has established the Animal Legal Education Initiative, which strives to incorporate animal law as a standalone discipline within the legal academy. This webinar series is intended to support those efforts by creating opportunities for adjunct professors across the country to connect and collaborate with one another. We also hope to provide you with all the academic resources and a support system that can help you accomplish your goals within your institutions. These webinars are truly intended to be conversational and a place in which we can all network. To that end, please feel free to send questions and comments in the chat or unmute yourself if at any point you have a question. I'll also reserve some time at the end for questions. We'd encourage you all to turn on your video if you are able and comfortable doing so, as it's always great to see your faces. Finally, I wanted to mention that if you missed our previous webinars, the recordings of those are up on the GW Law website, so please feel free to check those out. Also, today's event is being recorded and will be made available on the GW Law website. So if you'd like to reference back to today's discussion, it will be there for you to do so. And please feel free to share it with anybody who you think would be interested. The final thing I'll mention is that we already have our next webinar scheduled on January 15th. That webinar will be addressing dealing with difficulties in the classroom. Moving on to today's webinar, we will be discussing political issues in the teaching of animal law. We have a wonderful panel put together today, and I'd like to turn it over to them so that they can give a brief introduction on themselves. Dean Hessler, would you feel comfortable starting that?
Sure. Thank you, Andrew, for that wonderful start. My name is Kathy Hessler, for the folks who don't know me, and I'm the Assistant Dean of the Animal Law Program here at GW and the Director of the Animal Legal Education Initiative. And so part of our goal is to help support the community who is a part of teaching and to help create space and resources for folks to engage in conversation so they can do their work better. So that's me. I'll turn it over to Priscilla.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's discussion. My name is Priscilla Rader-Kolb, and I'm the Senior Law School Programs Attorney for the Animal Legal Defense Fund. I've been here with the organization since 2016, and I manage and oversee all of our student programmatic opportunities, including our student chapter work with student chapters across the country. But I also do a lot with academic outreach and facilitating bringing animal law courses into curriculums that either have been without animal law altogether or have, for whatever reason, had a pause in offering that course. I also work closely with ALEI and other partnerships with providing materials, content resources for adjuncts and law professors interested in teaching. And I will pass it over to Shelby.
Thank you, Priscilla. Thank you, Dean Hessler and Andrew. My name is Shelby Boboski. I am the Executive Director of the Texas Humane Legislation Network. We are a 501c4 in the state of Texas. We also have a C3 companion. And our mission is to promote the humane treatment of animals through legislation, education, and advocacy. But I am also an animal law adjunct with the Southern Methodist University College of Law. In the fall, I teach an animal law course. And in the spring, I teach a wildlife law course. And I've been teaching roughly in this adjunct position for around 5 years on the wildlife and 7 years on the animal law. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you. And I'll go ahead and pass it over to Nancy.
Thanks, Shelby. I'm Nancy Perry. I am so happy to be here with you all. It's really nice to have this opportunity. I am currently the Senior Vice President of Government Relations for the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, which is a national nonprofit organization, so a 501c3. And my role is to oversee the state and federal legislative work and try to press for policy reforms to protect animals. And I've been there for about a decade and a half. And before that, I was at the Humane Society of the United States doing very similar work, working on ballot measures, working on state legislation, working on federal legislation, overseeing the department. And prior to that, I went to Lewis and Clark Law School. So it's fun to be here with colleagues.
Is Nancy frozen for you? Okay. Yeah, same with me.
Being-
Also, Lewis and Clark alone.
Shout out.
That's wonderful. Hopefully we'll get Nancy back soon. I'll also give a quick introduction of myself. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Andrew Murphy. I'm a third year student at George Washington University Law School, and I'll be the moderator for today's event. I was grateful to be invited to get involved with this specific webinar, as I was actually first introduced to animal welfare issues in the classroom at relatively conservative schools. I attended high school in a very, conservative area and went to undergrad at a pretty conservative religious university. I had both a high school teacher and an environmental science professor bring up animal welfare in a very eloquent and logical way in the classroom that helped me get involved and learn more, as well as didn't seem controversial at all for anyone there. So I'm grateful for you all and all that you do, and that we can have this conversation. So let's get things kicked off with the first question. This will bring out the inner English major in me. But I wanted to ask, in y'all's opinion, what do we mean by political when we use that word? And how have you addressed kind of the definition of political in the classroom, potentially regarding the context of things like the EATS Act or animal testing or other potentially political issues that come up in the classroom?
I guess I can start and then folks can chime in. So I define political, oh good, and Nancy will be rejoining us. I define political really broadly, right? So political can be politicized, meaning in the body politic sphere issues. It can mean our work has political implications. You know, the cases that we're working on, obviously everything in the legal sphere has some kind of political connotation one way or another. And animal law tends to have defaults. People tend to think of animal law in a political way and don't think of animal law and animal sort of advocacy sort of separate, right? And they are, intertwined and connected. And I think it's useful to talk about that in class. But I do think it's useful to talk about animal law as law, and then whatever the political ramifications of that are, whatever the political realities of that are. I think students really enjoy hearing about like legal strategies and the pragmatic, how does this actually work? And, how are the parties working together if we're talking about the political setting? But how do we get to where we are, right? So what is the legislative process? What about the litigation? What about administrative agencies? What about regulatory systems? Like, how does all that actually work? And how do people's political viewpoints help or not help, animals in thinking about moving forward animal protection? So I think it's useful to talk about those things explicitly without presuming anything, right? So there are just things that are factual, and so it's useful to share that, but it's also useful to say that none of these things are siloed in the way that people might think about them, right? So all kinds of people want to protect animals, and all kinds of people are engaged in using and abusing animals, right? And so that kind of crosses boundaries that people might think are more sort of siloed, if you will. And so I think it's useful to have a broad view of what politics is, right? So it's hard not to talk about politics, and I think it's useful to do that just explicitly. There are times when we want to actually talk about politicians, right, and the impact they have, and whether they're supporting or not supporting certain things. And then what is the law and how is that separate? And then what are advocacy strategies and how are those things separate? And just not all the time, right? But I think it's useful to talk about that differently. So I have a really, really broad sort of internal definition for politics and what that looks like. But I know other people have great thoughts on this as well. Shelby, Nancy?
I can jump in, and I apologize. I lost internet a bit ago. I have no idea at what point I did. But I can just say I agree so much with the idea that, there's an established body of law that we can point to and understand how that law interacts with animals, and where there have been efforts to use those existing laws to protect existing animals. And then we can talk about where we can go from there. If our perspective is we want to expand protections for animals, which is very commonly, but not necessarily 100% of the time, the perspective that people are representing in our classrooms, but very much, the general goal, you'll find, and I think there are different ways to get there, but most folks would like to see animals protected in the classrooms that we're in. But Kathy's right. I mean, there are different motivations, and I think being open to the reality that there are different frameworks for getting there. There may be folks who feel like advancing protections for some types of animals are important, but other types are not. So we just have to be open to hearing those perspectives, and also be open about our own perspectives as adjunct professors. I think it's pointless to pretend that we have no perspective. We all come with our own backgrounds, and sharing that just as openly as you would share if you were a criminal law professor, whether you worked in defense or in prosecution, that's relevant to your experience and your knowledge and your background. So I think it's all very important, and I think we're entering a new era right now where we're going to see the twists and turns of that.
Well said, Dean Hessler and Nancy. I mean, at the end of the day, I really appreciated Max, his intro in terms of, where he came and where he came from school, where he went to school, and it being very conservative. So I am in a very burgundy state. We used to describe Texas as red, but now it's incredibly burgundy. And what Andrew said really resonated with me with respect to, that conservative background. I would say about 5 years ago, I didn't want anyone to really know my political affiliations or anything. And I tried to approach the class as very apolitical, truly. You could look at my bio and you could see where I worked and what I did, but I wanted everyone truly to come to class feeling very comfortable and open, because although some areas of our government might not work so smoothly, I wanted our class to be able to share different opinions respectfully. And now I'm finding that it's really a lot more challenging to be pretty apolitical. And, I'm seeing at least the politics kind of seep in different areas and venues, whether it is the EATS Act, whether it might be a very simple animal cruelty case that might have happened in a very rural area and so forth, on a ranch or a farm. So, my definition of politics used to be, you don't know where I fall. And I will say personally, I'm having challenges doing more and more of that, given where we are in the political climate.
I agree with everything the three panelists have already said. And just to chime in on a way that I've sort of considered the word politics is the connotation of that has changed so much in recent years. And it's sort of become kind of a dirty word for some people of like, oh, you're just bringing politics into it when you're talking about, human rights or something that is beyond politics. But Kathy mentioned how certain things are politicized. And I think that's what we're seeing a lot more of. And so it's sort of being turned into being politics. And so for me, yeah, I agree, mentioning it more and just being explicit of our definitions. Thank you, Andrew, for that. I think it's always really helpful to define your terms and the scope in which you're speaking. And so for me, like being able to say the P word, and present it in a somewhat neutral, but way where people know what you're talking about. You're not kind of beating around the bush that I think sometimes I have in the past. So similar to Shelby, sort of trying to be more explicit with it, but still kind of fostering that everyone comes from different perspectives, backgrounds, and you cannot necessarily assume someone's animal perception based on that background.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. And I'll just add two other quick things. One, when I was a brand new teacher, I think I thought it would be great to have a classroom full of like animal people, right? Because you just don't run into that very often. And I thought it would make for a great classroom. But actually, I found really quickly that different perspectives, right? It makes for much richer classroom conversation, and we all learn a lot more. And I'll also say that I often tell students they can't predict all of my particular, leanings or beliefs. And if they wanted to try, they're welcome to. But that I would guarantee they wouldn't get them all right. But even within the animal protection field, right? So people who are doing this work, we don't all agree with each other, and we don't all have the same both political leanings, and we don't have all the same views about what animal protection is and what the right legal outcomes are. And so it's useful to, I think, and we're people, so you kind of go to default and you kind of make assumptions, and we do tend to stereotype every once in a while just because that's what we do as people. But it's useful to have these kind of conversations and kind of lift that up and remind ourselves, right, that everybody's sort of wherever they are in the spectrum, and we can't make assumptions, which makes hopefully for better conversations when we have those conversations explicitly.
Thank you all for those insights. One theme that I'm picking up here is that politics are complex and they can, change often. On a very, I guess, practical note, how do you go about keeping your syllabus and your class materials updated with any political developments that might impact the content that you teach? I mean, I know that I've heard a lot of complaining from the administrative law professors around GW. So how does that impact your work?
This is Shelby. I'm happy to start. It's really interesting, Andrew, because at the beginning of all of my classes, I like to take sometimes 5 to 10 minutes and talk about a recent issue that has affected whether it's wildlife law or animal law. And so that usually kind of sets the tone with what we'll be talking about with respect to maybe something to do with the Endangered Species Act. And, sometimes I'll throw in there when we're talking about the particular act, this was actually passed by President Nixon, and sometimes it really shocks a lot of the students in the classroom. And I think it really opens up their perspectives in terms of which administrations passed what and did what. So I always like to start off the class with something pretty current if I can, and kind of take it from there. But in terms of, updating the syllabus, it can be challenging. As we know, like, for example, Secretary of Interior and some of the other acts that we look at, Marine Mammal Protection Act, who is the current administration and what happened in the last administration and were there changes there. So, we can try to avoid politics as much as we can, but sometimes bringing it to light really helps the conversation and for people to understand different perspectives that they never would have thought happened, specifically when animal protection legislation passed and realizing, well, that happened during a Republican presidency. Yeah, it did.
Yeah, I echo that. I think it's useful to all of the cases that we study and the pieces of legislation are enacted within a particular legal framework that has a particular political, reality to it, right? And so it's useful, I think, to talk about those things. I mentioned, so just in the way that you did, Shelby, in our class recently, that, the National Meat Association case versus Harris was Kamala Harris, right? And so it's not the kind of thing you think about, and it's useful to think about role and about how are these things happening and who's supporting what and all of that. And so thinking about that, thinking about how to do that is a challenge, right? And so I find that I need to, with the materials that I find, the case book, right, needs to be updated, just because it gets outdated really, really quickly. And so we too start with news. And that's one way to sort of bring in what's going on currently, whether it's legal or whether it's not legal. But there's always a legal implication. And so getting us to think about it. But it's a challenge. And I think one of the biggest challenges I have is I don't want to assign students a lot more reading, right? And so as these things are happening in the semester, I don't want to add to my syllabus more reading. And so I find at least one of my shorthand ways is that I just kind of talk about stuff, right? And I may ask students what they know about it or what they've heard about it. And so we'll have a conversation, but I'm not assigning a lot more reading. And I'm also trying to find ways to sort of shorthand, right, this information. And I think it's especially challenging right now because the courts themselves are sort of evolving in how they're looking at like fundamental areas of law, like the rule of law and the administrative state and regulatory authority and those kinds of things. And that's all. So it's really, 10 years ago, I could say, this is kind of how the courts are handling these kind of cases. And now it's a lot harder for me to say that with any kind of certainty, I guess. So I say a lot, we'll see, or this is where we're going, or it's not clear, which is not a particularly satisfactory teaching modality, right? But and as a result, right, or related to that, I think it's partly our job as teachers to help students figure out how to live in that world, because that's increasingly the world that lawyers are going to be living in, right? That there's less certainty and there's more rapid evolution of the legal frameworks that we're operating under, and we're all just kind of figuring out how to manage that. So that's an ongoing challenge, I think, for teachers and for students. Nancy, it's good to have you back. I don't know if you want to wait.
Sorry.
It's okay.
I never have this happen. It's just bizarre. Which question are we speaking to?
I'll let Andrew repeat it.
Yeah, no, we're glad that you're back. We were talking about how we keep our syllabi updated with any potential political developments, as well as we've been chatting a little bit about how we like to share, I guess, political current events in the classroom.
Well, that's part of what I love about teaching while working in the field of policy reform. It's easy to stay in a bubble in the work that we do and to sort of be in your own little community and thinking about your own little thoughts. And in fact, when we revise the syllabus every single semester or year, it's a real opportunity to do some searching and to do some research, and I like to both do sort of traditional research around where things have updated or changed, but I really like to reach out to colleagues in the field who have specialty areas and ask them, is there or on constitutional law, and whatever their area may be. I think it's important to lean on each other. We have folks who in our community who are litigating these issues, who are far more familiar with them and the twists and turns than those in the policy realm specifically. So really, I think this group is actually a remarkably helpful place to turn for updates. So I also love opening the class to any possible current events. Some semesters we've even reserved a night for hot topics, and then we've had the class vote on what area have they heard about lately they would like to hear more on. And it's sort of fun. It's like a lottery, like you find out what you're gonna work on, and then you get to go explore that topic area for the night. And sometimes we have the students involved in developing the content. Sometimes, we take the lead. So I think it's really positive to weave those things in and be open to being nimble. On a given night, something major might happen, and you might want to even change your course for that night and be willing to devote a part of the class to a current event. I'm sure right now everyone's thinking about the recent federal election and the implications of it, and what does it mean? What are these new appointments going to mean to shape our thoughts on that? So it's really an exciting time. And while I'm sure many view it as, foreclosing opportunities, I don't think that's necessarily true. I think there's really genuinely, when things change and new thinking takes hold, there really are opportunities that we break up the status quo a bit. It may not be the opportunities we want, it may not be what we were expecting, but I think that there will be sort of a strange area of opportunity for us in the next year or two to think about ways to change society. That's what we're after.
Thank you very much. And I just wanted to let everybody know in the audience as well, that if you have any questions or comments on anything that's being discussed, feel free to unmute, raise your hand, or whatever you're comfortable with. Type something in the chat. We'd love to hear what you're thinking. I'll just add that I really appreciate it when professors share issues, especially around current events. I think that you all are like extremely knowledgeable and have a lot of experience, especially as adjunct professors, experience outside of the classroom too. I don't know, Priscilla has heard this from students as well, but I absolutely love it when people bring in their outside experience and share that really practical knowledge in the classroom that sometimes we don't get in our other classes.
Yeah, I definitely hear that often from students regarding when their professors take the time to explain the news to them in a way that relates back to, animals or something that they're interested in. I think a lot of times, you read the headlines or you read the SCOTUS blog and you're not really you understand what happened, but you're not really you're not able to put it in the big picture concept. And so students really do love that. I love that as a student. One other thing that we did during my public international law course is every session a student was kind of on to present news. So that's another way to sort of flip it, and you get some pretty interesting things that you might not get in your own timeline or as part of your own news sources. So having students, if it's a smaller group, especially where you're able to kind of build that camaraderie, that safe space where they're getting public speaking experience, research experience, having to explain, maybe high level concepts, whatever it might be, that's really great practical experience, but also you just learn so much and you get insights into what's interesting for students and what is sort of on their minds. But yeah, definitely to your point, Andrew.
Andrew, if I can just tell a quick story to build off what Priscilla said. So I was trying to get my students to talk more. And so instead of me bringing the current topic, hot topic up, I asked a student, I said, hey, will you bring it next time? And it happened to be the time, if you all remember or know about this, where somebody had carved the word Trump into a manatee. And my student brought this up, and I was like, "Ruh-roh," I didn't, I gave him complete carte blanche to talk about it, and it really added so much to the class. Everybody was excited to talk about it, how they could protect this manatee. Obviously, under Endangered Species Act, we talked about the fines. We talked about, was the animal really harmed because it was in the algae? Like, it was just fascinating, where I was really worried at first, and it ended up being such a great conversation. So I love when those kind of organic conversations just happen. And yes, maybe sweating a little bit, but it worked out. So,
Yeah, I think I'll add, because fundamental to the question is sort of just classroom management, right? Is challenged sort of all the time, and time management is a problem. And there's already so many things we don't have time to talk about that we want to talk about. And so I think, it took me a while to realize, all right, so if we're gonna address sort of something current, which is a much more rich sort of learning opportunity, then I even need to take some time from this class, or it may relate to something we were going to do in 2 weeks, right? If we're not getting to the ESA, and then so we'll just take a little of that time away, right? Because we're actually talking about it now. And so I have found it balances, right? It evens out. It's a little bit, well, it's a lot easier in courses that are paper courses, right? That have a paper requirement instead of an exam. And so what I found for exam classes is I just have to make sure I am covering all of the things that are going to be on the exam, or I can just like adjust my exam, right? Which in the end is actually not that hard to do. So, yeah, so I think it's scary in a way to let go of, right, the plan, because you work really hard on the plan for class, and you're hoping it's a good plan, and it's supposed to be for the student's benefit. And so adjusting the plan seems scary, right? Or sometimes even irresponsible. But I completely agree. I don't think it is. I think it's better learning, and I think it's a better experience for the students overall.
I know that, you know, sometimes I'm sometimes a little bit of an anxious person, and I feel, shy or anxiety, when I'm getting ready to participate in a class. Um, how do you help students to feel welcome and feel comfortable, in participating in these discussions that we've been talking about, or, just in class in general?
I think it's really important to set a tone that everyone has a really valuable perspective in that room, and that it's a comfortable place, it's a safe space for people to have differing opinions, and that we actually want that, because that means we have more ideas in the room. And so by articulating that in the generic sense, you're giving anyone who might have, an inclination to weigh in a little bit of a nudge. And then as the conversation goes on, I think being willing to say, oh my gosh, these are really great perspectives that have come out. Does anyone else have anything else? And maybe even if you feel comfortable, and this is one of those instinctual things, maybe even asking an individual, what did you think about that? Just being more conversational yourself, and not presentational, not formal. That may not work for every class, that people teach. So it's just the way that I think I've found that, can invite people to feel comfortable. And then thanking them, later on, it's really great that you brought that perspective. Sometimes even the, out of left field perspective is really, as Shelby pointed out, the one that really gets the conversation buzzing. So really being welcoming.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think that we can pair those goals with different like classroom techniques. And So different students have different learning styles and different levels of anxiety and sort of risk tolerance and all of that. And so one of the things that I have found helpful, especially, well, in general, is to give students like leadership roles and with notice, right? And have some say in what it is that they're going to do in class, like when it is that they're going to take a leadership role, when they're going to speak up more. And then just a sense of what that looks like, what's expected of them, and then sort of modeling what Nancy's saying, right? So if we're modeling kind of the tone we want to set, then it's much easier for everybody else to kind of develop that classroom culture where it's supportive. And so a mix of some of the spontaneous, because some students aren't real comfortable with the spontaneous, and a mix of the sort of pre-planned, usually I think gets sort of helps all the students in the class one way or the other. So they might be uncomfortable on one day, but then they're comfortable on another day, or more comfortable on another day. And it's trying to accommodate that, and also develop sort of some resilience, right, in dealing with the areas in which we're not comfortable. So I think one of the other things, sort of following on what Nancy said, in addition to being grateful and acknowledging it's good to have these perspectives, that part of our job is to help students learn how to have disagreements, right? And how to maintain their own perspective even when they disagree with someone else, and to do that respectfully and thoughtfully, meaning like, well, what, you can't, just not like, I disagree and that's that, right? Why? And like, what are the facts? What's the evidence? Or what is, tell us more about that. So that's our job, right, as lawyers. And so our job as law professors is to help students get to that space. And to the degree we want lawyers to be problem solvers in the world, so not just litigators and legislators, right, but problem solvers, that's kind of what we do, then we have to help students build their capacity, right, to engage in challenging conversations and to do it in a way that they can do it with integrity, with who they are, and maintain their sort of identities and their comfort, their sort of their security, right, but maybe not always their comfort, right, and to go outside their comfort zones and to build strength to do that kind of challenging work, because that's what we need lawyers to do. And so being able to do some of that in the classroom, I think, is a helpful bridge, right, in transition, again, with good modeling and good support. And then things don't always go perfectly, and I think it's also, again, as a new teacher, I wanted everything to be just so, right? But it's just not how the world goes. And I think it's so much easier than I thought it would be to go, that didn't go as well as I'd like, let's try that again. Or, I thought about what happened last week and I'd like to say a little more about it, or give us space to address something. And not only is that not bad, it's actually better, right? Because I think that is modeling. We're all human, we make mistakes, and it's so much better to address something and work to make it better than just ignore it, right, and pretend it didn't happen. That's not actually professionally responsible, right? We have to actually address stuff. And teachers are super duper lucky because, we have the next class and we can come back to something, say, oh, I forgot to mention this, or, this didn't come out right, or, whatever. We have that opportunity. It's not like a courtroom where, you're one and done, right? So I think it's really great for us to make use of that opportunity, and to help with our students think through about, did this all go the way that we wanted it to go? How's the learning working? And we can touch base with students from time to time, like in class, out of class, like how's the class going for you? Are there things you'd like us to change, right? And you can do that sort of informally, or you can do it formally. So I haven't done it in a little bit, but I have a minute paper that I would give students saying, like, what did you learn today? What things are you left with confusion on? And, is there something that you'd like to see happening differently in class? Just to give another, and again, pardon?
I remember that in clinic to this day. Yep, it was very helpful to deduce thoughts down.
Yeah, and it's just a different modality. No, it's great, right? Because some students you wouldn't want you to ask them and put them on the spot, right? And so having a written option where people can kind of think about it for a minute. Yeah. So yeah, just different ways. Go ahead, Priscilla.
Yeah, I just have to just build off of this. I have a very specific example that I still remember from law school. So I thought maybe it would be helpful as a fellow anxious person. In creating safe space as well, trying to be cognizant of how the room is going. Like if the vibe shifts, if the energy shifts, being able to politely, calmly kind of stop conversation too, I think is helpful. So example, I've been in a class before where it did feel safe and everything, but if one person has an opinion and there's like 5 people all disagreeing with that opinion and it's just sort of going around and around, being able to stop it. I've been in a classroom where the professor hasn't stopped that, and a classroom where a professor has stopped that. And I think that's also really important, is knowing your own boundaries and being able to kind of on the fly sort of redirect when it does sort of get off the rails a little.
So don't be afraid to jump in and shift things, is what you're saying. Yeah. I was thinking about this question sort of in the context of our theme tonight and the political question, and remembering that over the years, probably the majority of the perspectives that I've heard from students in classes have come more from the left, but there have been these individuals who are approaching the topic from a more conservative political framework. And those discussions have been so rich when we've been able to include everyone's perspective. And I try to think of it just, in the sort of professional context, when we're lobbying for animals and trying to advance legislation, we can't just talk to one perspective and get that done. Our entire system is set up, and I realize it's very flawed. So this is the old school Aristotle viewpoint that, we still hope to retain in our minds, even if we're not seeing it work out in every forum. But the idea is it's a didactic, and we need differing viewpoints to clash. And the point of the clash is not to have fights or conflicts or dislike each other. It's to find out how the ideas stand up in that clash. So if we believe that animals are deserving of protection for any number of reasons, we can be confident that having discussion that brings out differing viewpoints is helpful to affirming that goal in the long run. And we certainly can't interface with the world that we're in if we're not comfortable with those conversations happening. So I feel like somehow really explaining that this is, as Kathy said, this is what we do. We are professional critical thinkers, and we are professional expressors of thoughts. So we need to figure out how to do that in our own voice. You don't have to do it uncomfortably. Sometimes the softest voice in the room is the most powerful one, Andrew. So don't worry about that. But I think having that spirit with you, where if you hear, a differing viewpoint, asking for more on that, and then welcoming that into the conversation. It can be tough sometimes, but I think it's really worth it if you can have more of that. I mean, I think we often don't get that because we might not have as much in the way of differing viewpoints in the room. Fortunately, here in DC, we've had folks who come from different perspectives in the classroom, and that really does make it much richer, I think.
Just, excuse me, from my perspective, we have really rich dialogue that might not happen in the beginning of the semester, but as people feel more comfortable talking about things, I see it more towards the end. But to answer your question, Andrew, not every single statement in at least my classroom is protected and important, and I want to see and hear you. So I have a lot of hunters and landowners and ranchers and farmers, and I also have people that are vegans and vegetarians and would never pick up a gun. And we've had really incredible conversations without anger. And what Nancy was saying is going back to that critical thinking. For example, we talk in one of my classes about invasive species and feral hogs in Texas. And I really am proud of the conversations that we can have around that topic and everybody feeling protected. They don't agree, but they at least feel respected and protected, that their voice is important. So.
Thank you very much. That was very insightful. This question might we might have already answered part of it, but I'm going to ask it anyways. So when we're navigating, political issues that might upset students, but not just students, also potentially, administrators, um, colleagues, or donors. Do you run into issues like that in your teaching? And if you do, how do you deal with those?
I can start because I do think it's a real issue, and I think it depends on the culture of each school, right? It depends, and it's particularly more challenging for people who don't have security, right? So adjunct professors are sort of the least secure people in the building, and so it becomes more complicated and more sensitive an issue for them to consider. And we have a couple of states that are now trying to mandate, right, what can or cannot be said within a classroom context, and people are trying to figure out if it applies to the universities and so on and so forth. But clearly we have universities with a perspective, right? We have universities within communities that have a dominant perspective. We have deans and lots of people, right, who are now, and this is going to become more important, right? We have had congressional hearings where the presidents of universities have been called to defend, right, what they do or they don't do with respect to speech that is considered all kinds of things, right? So I think it's going to become sort of a more important issue, sadly, rather than a less important issue. And I think people have to feel like recognize that they have some actual safety, job safety kinds of issues to think about. I think that once people actually hear what it is we're talking about, there shouldn't be problems, right? Because we're talking about the law and we're talking about facts and evidence and cases and legislation, and then the politics that come with that. And in that way, I don't think what we do is sort of that much different than what happens in a con law class. But it is sort of inherently a little more political than, I don't know, your civil procedure class, right? And so I think there is some of that we have to be prepared for. So I think it's useful if we as teachers think about like what is it that we're talking about and why are we talking about it, and if we can defend why we're talking about it in terms of legal pedagogy, then I think we should be fine. That doesn't mean that we will be fine. And so I also think it's going to be useful for this community and other communities to support one another when and if there are challenges. I'll say that early days when I started teaching, I think I was probably had the sixth animal law class in the country or something like that. So it was a long time ago. And one of the conversations was always, are you going to teach like the other side, right? Are you just going to teach like the animal stuff? And it's like, well, if I was teaching about child abuse or elder abuse, I'm not going to teach the other side. I'm not pro-abuse, right? And so in that same way, no, I'm not. I am going to talk about, the rationales behind the use of animals in different contexts, and I'm not going to like demonize that. But there's an inherent goal to, as has already been said, moving towards the protection of animals. And so that is the theme, right? And then within that, I'm going to have a clear-eyed view and legal analysis, and that will take us where it takes us. But yeah, it is more, I'm worried that we're getting into a more challenging time. But time will tell, and hopefully I'll be wrong. But I do think there's a lot more conversation around sort of censorship, if you will, in the academic space now than in any time that I've been teaching, which is over 30 years.
I'm happy just to say that as an adjunct, I had no understanding of what I could and could not talk about politically. And until this discussion came up, the only other time I heard about it was in our state in Texas. There was a Texas A&M professor that was basically suspended and accused of criticizing our lieutenant governor. And I understand that she was put on paid admin leave and she was investigated, and then nothing came of it. But I really never thought about it until that time. So at that time, I reached out to our school and I said, "Hey, what can I talk about? Do you have guidelines? Can I understand that?" And quite frankly, if anybody doesn't know Dean Hessler, she is such an amazing mentor to someone that's been teaching for a couple of years. So, just always going to your university first as an adjunct and trying to get those guidelines, rules, regulations. And even when I asked him, it was just kind of, well, this is what this is what you should do, but it's really up to you. And I was really appreciative of the freedom that I had. But like Dean Hessler said, I think we're moving into a bit of a different era. So we'll have to watch this space. But it is something that I always just recommend that anybody who is teaching as an adjunct at a new school, always reach out to your adjunct dean and see if there's any guidance that they can give you, because you always want to stay in that framework.
There are a few moments where I'm grateful I'm still a student, but I think that that might be one of them. Dealing with these issues sounds very complex, and I appreciate those insights. Thank you to our wonderful panelists today. We really appreciate your sensitivity and your engagement in these important issues. We have just under 10 minutes left. I'd like to open it up to everybody for questions or comments. Or if the panelists would like to add anything else, I don't want to, cut you off on anything. So please feel free to share.
I have a question. I apologize in advance. It's a very narrow question, but I'd like to continue the theme of anxiety. It's something I'm worrying about as I prep my first animal law course. And thank you all, by the way. This has been like incredibly helpful. So I'm wondering about the teaching animals property status and legal personhood and the sort of, obvious doctrinal tradition and animal law of analogizing to historically oppressed human groups that once also had property status, right? So whether it's enslaved persons or women or children, I have mentioned that to a non-animal law colleague just to say, this might be tricky to teach because a lot of people understandably have averse reactions to it. There's obviously scholarship arguing against those type of arguments. And my colleague was like, yeah, you shouldn't teach that, right? But I was like, well, it's just part of the subject. So I just wondered, do you sort of like offer a disclaimer with that, like everything else? Or if anyone has that experience with that in particular?
Well, I think you don't have to own opinions. You can provide opportunities for students to explore these topics and then steward the conversation by asking, what did you think about that? Did that seem valid to you? What are the benefits of looking at it from this perspective? What are the disadvantages? So you're not responsible for, adherence to every viewpoint that you expose your class to. You don't want to, it's already a difficult topic. I find the more challenging pieces like talking about the animal crushing cases, which are, there's sexual content. It involves absolutely grotesque torture. And so that I worry more about, harming students by exposure to such difficult graphic topics. But when it comes to ideas and equating things or historical development of rights and the ways, other movements and efforts have emerged, I feel like you don't have to make too big of a case that that is what we're doing with animals, as much as just these are really interesting to look at and think about as we ponder, the plight of animals in our society. I've maybe that's too disingenuous, but I really actually believe that. I'm not sure any of us knows exactly what the right thing is. We're not teaching what is right. We're providing opportunities to think about these things. You're going to be great, by the way, Conley.
Thank you. Well, we'll see. But I appreciate that. That's super helpful, Nancy. And I think this goes back to Kelly's point earlier, just super quick, like what you're saying is absolutely right. And I think it's true of all law faculty, right? But I also think that it's like harder for us as animal law and as advocates to sort of like convince people that, hey, we actually are just like teaching this material, right? And not imposing our own perspectives on it. To the extent that that's possible, I don't know. I just think it's trickier. So that's very helpful. Thank you.
Well, and I'll add something quick, which is that you can also offer some of that critique at the same time, right? So if you want to assign the reading and then assign the critique of it, right, that it actually, I think, will shortcut some of the conversation, right? It allows people to critique it. I think it's actually really helpful to let students know that we can critique the material, right? They're not perfect. And then you can have a conversation about this is one way to frame the development of animal law within the development of legal systems in our history, right? It's a part of that sort of social justice history. It's a part of, and so it's useful to see how does law evolve. And then we can talk about what's the right way to talk about that, or, you know, do we agree with these analyses? But I think offering the counterpoint right away or to the students, so any student who might be really mad or offended by that, if you offer the counterpoint with it, right, that's going to help. And that will allow students to see there are different ways to approach these conversations. And so I think that can take the heat out a little bit of the conversation.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry, I put really long comments in the chat. And you know, I hope that this is for people to read later or whatever. I would love to expand this discussion. I think this is great. And I'd like to have more discussions with other people about techniques that they've used. I teach in Louisiana. I teach at LSU and Tulane, and they're very different schools. And over the years, I've developed some techniques that I think have really opened up the discussion to students and really opened up people to explore political things without being too judgmental of others or themselves, and let them even explore it themselves. Like, what if I believed this? What if I had to represent this? And it's been really good for the discussion. So I put a bunch of stuff in the chat, but I would love to talk about this more with people. I think this panel has been wonderful, and yeah, so. But I do think the main thing I do, like my very first session, I set up with a lot of things that there's no right answer to, and a couple things that cut across political divides, and then that sets the tone for the rest of the class, and that has been really important and really worked well.
I especially like that you do the like, what if this was your client and you can't choose that they're not your client. I really like that exercise. I definitely think we should continue these conversations, and yeah, just reading your program there. It's really cool. Thank you for sharing, Michelle.
And I can say one real quick thing about continuing the conversation. So we're generally going to continue these webinars, so to talk about teaching. And so, yeah, so we've got 4 more scheduled for the spring semester, and we're going to be planning a day-long adjunct pedagogy kind of workshop, sort of for late spring, early summer. So yeah, we want to continue the conversations. We want to create space for that to happen, even beyond what we're providing, and resources for people to do their jobs as well as they want to do them. So yeah, so please don't.
Oh, yeah. I'll just add, Michelle, you know, if you ever wanted to, you know, put a Zoom together and invite some folks, I'm sure we can you know, talk, and it can just be more organic, nothing, you know, formal or anything that, you know, gets published or anything, but just us chatting. Happy to do that too, because, yeah, we're in for some changes coming up in the next year, and it will be good to have community and have that space to talk. So awesome.
I do want to interrupt real quick and just say there's interesting news that just came out this week from Louisiana about an environmental law professor at LSU and the governor. And I don't want to talk about it too much here, but it was all about politics and a professor talking in his class. So if you want to Google that, it is very interesting. Yeah. And I have thoughts on it, but I'm not going to waste time on that right now.
Can I ask, are you talking about the tiger incident?
No, that
There's
also
something
was
else.
recent.
Yeah.
This is just happened 2 days ago. This is
Understood. Thank you.
yeah, we can talk about the tiger and
We talked about the tiger incident in my class last week, so
I have opinions.
We did too. Yeah. Yeah, but
just
this
real
is
quick on
more
that.
academic. Yeah, this is academic freedom kind of.
Interestingly, the local newspaper did a survey, and 90% of the LSU fans said that they objected to it.
Wow.
Helpful, right?
Yeah.
it's a really quick. Mascots, live mascots now is a great beginning of class topic to talk about. Because at my school, we have a pony called Peruna. And it actually sits out front when our students go in the beginning of the year. So whether it's tigers, whether it's Bevo, the Longhorn at UT, it's just such a rich topic that gets my students talking. So
Yeah, we have a husky at UConn. The husky always has the same name, even though it's not the same husky all the time.
Great minds think alike, Shelby. I was just gonna say that that sounds like a really interesting current event discussion. I want to be respectful of everybody's time, so I just wanted to give a huge thanks to the panelists and everybody here. I think that you all are why the community is so great. I hope that you enjoyed today's webinar and found the discussion informative. As a reminder, our next webinar will be on January 15th, and we'll be addressing dealing with difficulties in the classroom. We hope that you can join us for that. Also, if anyone is interested in potentially participating in a future webinar or has thoughts or feedback to share, please feel free to connect with Dean Hessler. Thank you again all so much, and I hope that you have a fantastic rest of your day.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you
Andrew.
everyone so much.
Thanks.
thank you, Andrew.